For 60 years, the Cuban Missile Crisis has been taught as a clean, simple story. The United States stood strong, the Soviet Union blinked, and the world was saved from nuclear war because of American resolve. But once you begin examining the documents, the private letters, the declassified tapes, and the negotiations that never made it into public memory, the story becomes far more confusing. Why did the Soviets suddenly withdraw despite having a strategic advantage in missile range? Why did the US secretly remove its missiles from Turkey months later and never announce it publicly? Why did Fidel Castro, the man at the center of the entire crisis, refuse to back down even when both superpowers were panicking? And most importantly, if the world came this close to nuclear annihilation, why do both sides claim victory in their history books? These contradictions create a strange question. In a crisis where everyone almost lost everything, who actually won? And more importantly, what does winning even mean when the stakes involve global survival? In this video, we're going to break down the crisis from all sides, American, Soviet, and Cuban, to understand what really happened beneath the famous speeches and newspaper headlines. The popular version of history begins on October 14, 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile bases being constructed in Cuba. The truth, however, began months earlier. Nikita Khrushchev, facing political pressure inside the Kremlin, believed that placing nuclear missiles in Cuba would equalize the strategic imbalance between the US and the USSR. At the time, the United States had hundreds of nuclear warheads stationed in Europe and Turkey, pointed directly at Moscow. The Soviets had far fewer missiles capable of reaching the American mainland. In Khrushchev's words, "We must give the Americans a taste of their own medicine." On top of that, the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs invasion had convinced him that the US could attack Cuba again at any moment. By placing missiles there, he hoped to both protect Castro and strengthen the Soviet bargaining position. When President John F. Kennedy was informed, the tapes from the Oval Office reveal a remarkably tense atmosphere. Kennedy's advisors, especially the Joint Chiefs, argued for an immediate airstrike and possibly an invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy hesitated. He remembered how quickly World War I escalated because politicians believed they had no choice. So he insisted on a naval quarantine instead of an invasion. It was a blockade in all but name, carefully chosen to avoid being labeled an act of war under international law. On television, Kennedy addressed the nation, stating that any missile launched from Cuba would be treated as a Soviet attack on the United States. The American public saw firmness and control. But behind the scenes, Kennedy was terrified by the possibility of miscalculation. At the same time, Khrushchev was facing his own nightmare. American ships were surrounding Cuba, Soviet ships were approaching the blockade line, and the entire world watched with breath held. If the Soviets backed down too quickly, Khrushchev would be seen as weak by the Kremlin hardliners. If he pushed too far, nuclear war would break out. And right in the middle was Fidel Castro, who had his own view of what victory meant. Castro believed the US would invade no matter what, and at one point he even wrote a letter urging the Soviets to prepare for a nuclear strike if the US attacked Cuba. Castro was not a passive observer. He was willing to risk nuclear war to defend his revolution. What most people don't know is that during this tense period, Soviet troops in Cuba already had tactical nuclear weapons under their control. American intelligence did not know this at the time. If the US had invaded, Soviet commanders on the ground were authorized to use battlefield nuclear weapons. In other words, the crisis was not only about missile launch sites. It was about thousands of Soviet soldiers in Cuba prepared to fight and possibly launch nukes without Moscow's approval. The world was far closer to nuclear war than any leader admitted publicly. As the crisis deepened, both sides searched for a way out. The US demanded the removal of the missiles. The Soviets demanded a guarantee that the US would never invade Cuba. But there was another element, one rarely acknowledged in simplified history books: the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. These nuclear missiles were old, exposed, and militarily obsolete, but politically they symbolized American strength in Europe. Khrushchev insisted they were a threat. Kennedy privately agreed they didn't matter strategically, but he could not remove them publicly without appearing weak. Here is where the real negotiation began, not in public speeches, but in secret through back channels, journalists, diplomats, and private letters. One key moment came when a BC News reporter, John Scully, delivered a message from the Soviets suggesting a possible trade, missiles out of Cuba for a no-invasion pledge. But a second, more aggressive letter soon followed, demanding the removal of the Turkish missiles as well. Kennedy and his brother, Robert, realized the first letter came from Khrushchev himself, while the second was likely from the military hardliners. The U.S. chose to respond to the first letter publicly and negotiate the second one privately. And this is where the history becomes controversial. Publicly, Kennedy announced that the Soviets had agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. The world saw it as an American victory. But privately, the U.S. agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey within a few months. The agreement was deliberately kept secret so Kennedy would not face backlash from NATO allies or American politicians. Even in later interviews, American officials admitted that the trade was essential to resolving the crisis. So if the U.S. gave up missiles and the USSR gave up missiles, who actually won? The answer depends on how you define victory. The U.S. demonstrated naval power, political resolve, and forced the Soviets into a public retreat. The Soviets, on the other hand, secured a U.S. guarantee not to invade Cuba, a guarantee that has held ever since, while also achieving a quiet, face-saving concession in Turkey. As for Castro, he felt betrayed by the Soviets for removing the missiles without consulting him. Yet he achieved his ultimate goal. Cuba survived. But beneath the surface of this diplomatic theater lies the deeper question. Did the crisis strengthen the U.S.? Weaken the USSR? Simply reveal the terrifying fragility of nuclear diplomacy? As we continue, we'll dive into the final days of negotiation, explore why Khrushchev accepted the deal, and uncover how this crisis set the stage for the next phase of the Cold War. As the world watched the crisis unfold on radio and television, the final days of the standoff were far more chaotic behind the scenes than any public statement revealed. Kennedy's executive committee ExComm was split between those who believed the Soviet withdrawal was a trap and those who felt they were witnessing an opportunity for peace unlike anything in the Cold War. The tape recordings reveal Kennedy constantly steering his advisors away from rash military action. He warned them that even a small attack on Cuba could trigger full-scale war because, as he said, "You're gonna kill thousands of Russians then, and that's a hell of a decision to make over some missiles." Statements like this show that Kennedy's priority was not simply winning, but surviving. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev was facing criticism from his own Politburo. The hardliners accused him of acting too aggressively by placing missiles in Cuba without proper planning. Others claimed he wasn't being aggressive enough in resisting U.S. pressure. Khrushchev understood that he had walked his country into a corner, and any further escalation could cost millions of Soviet lives. According to declassified Soviet transcripts, Khrushchev told his advisors, "We cannot let the world be destroyed for our pride." But pride was exactly what was at stake. The USSR had taken a bold step to challenge American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and now it had to find a graceful way out before losing credibility. This is why the secret deal over the Turkish missiles became the turning point. The U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey had long been a diplomatic irritant. They were slow, vulnerable, and outdated compared to American submarines that could strike the USSR from anywhere. But symbolically, they represented NATO strength. The Soviets believed removing them would restore some balance. Kennedy's advisors, however, warned him that if he removed the missiles publicly, America's NATO allies, especially Turkey and Italy, would interpret it as surrendering to Soviet pressure. Kennedy needed a solution that satisfied the Soviets, but maintained the image of victory for the Americans. Robert F. Kennedy's secret meeting with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin is one of the most important but least publicized moments of the entire crisis. In that private discussion, Robert Kennedy stated that while the United States could not publicly agree to remove the Turkish missiles, they would do so quietly as long as the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba immediately and pledged transparency. Dobrinin's notes describe Robert Kennedy as tense, pale, and shaken, fully aware that he might be delivering the last peaceful message before nuclear war. The Soviets accepted the deal. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that he was ordering the dismantling and removal of the Cuban missiles. Publicly, he framed it as a contribution to world peace, praising Kennedy for showing common sense. Privately, he wrote to Castro explaining that the world had come too close to catastrophe. Castro, furious and feeling betrayed, argued that Cuba had been reduced to a pawn in a superpower game. But whether he liked it or not, Cuba survived intact, and that survival was its own form of victory. The American public rejoiced. U.S. newspapers printed triumphant headlines. Kennedy wins and Moscow backs down. To the world, it looked like a clear-cut victory. The Soviets had sent missiles to Cuba, the Americans had demanded their removal, and the Soviets had complied. Kennedy's approval ratings skyrocketed. Historians often describe these 13 days as Kennedy's finest hour. But the view from Moscow was more complicated. While the immediate reaction was negative, Khrushchev believed he had achieved several long-term goals. He protected Cuba from American invasion, claimed the moral high ground by calling for nuclear restraint, and secured the secret removal of the U.S. missiles in Turkey, something he could use internally to justify the withdrawal. Some Soviet military planners even believed the crisis proved that America was unwilling to risk nuclear war, which they saw as a Soviet psychological victory. But whether this was true or wishful thinking remains a matter of debate. When examining the crisis today with access to declassified materials from all three countries, the idea of victory becomes blurry. For one, the U.S. didn't know how close it came to disaster. On October 27th, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet commander acting without permission. Many generals in Washington considered this an act of war. Kennedy refused to retaliate because he knew the Soviets might follow with nuclear strikes. That same day, a U.S. Navy destroyer dropped practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine near the blockade line, not realizing the submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. 3 Soviet officers had to vote unanimously before launching it. 2 voted no. 1 voted yes. If all 3 had voted yes, the world might have ended in minutes. These near misses show the shocking truth. No one truly controlled the crisis. Victory or loss could have come from a single misunderstanding, an angry commander, a wrong radar reading. The leaders managed the political narrative, but thousands of soldiers, pilots, and sailors unknown to history held the world's fate in their hands. Yet even with all of this chaos, the aftermath of the crisis reshaped the Cold War in ways that made both sides believe they had won something. For the United States, the crisis proved that the Soviet Union would back down under pressure, encouraging Kennedy and later Johnson to take tougher stances in Vietnam and other Cold War conflicts. It also strengthened America's image as the dominant global power. For the Soviet Union, the crisis led to a renewed focus on building intercontinental ballistic missiles to ensure they would never again face such a disadvantage. In a strange way, the crisis pushed the USSR toward military parity with the United States, which it achieved by the late 1960s. For Cuba, the crisis ensured its survival. The U.S. pledged never to invade again, which allowed Castro to remain in power for decades. Though Castro never forgave the Soviets for removing the missiles without consultation, he emerged from the crisis as the symbol of successful resistance to American power. And for the world, the crisis forced both superpowers to rethink nuclear diplomacy. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, the famous red telephone, was established to prevent future misunderstandings. Within a year, both sides signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, reducing the most dangerous nuclear tests. This was not because anyone trusted each other, but because everyone understood how close they had come to total destruction. So who actually won the Cuban Missile Crisis? America won the public relations battle. The Soviet Union won a private concession and a guarantee of Cuban security. Cuba survived a superpower confrontation and kept its sovereignty. But the real outcome is even more paradoxical. The world's most dangerous standoff ended with both sides claiming victory, yet both walking away terrified by how easily everything could have ended. Maybe the only real winner was the world itself, because in the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, when pride, ideology, and nuclear power all collided, the leaders stepped back from the brink at the last possible moment. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes the greatest victory is simply surviving,